Good evening, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening.
Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning, this afternoon, this evening, wherever you are in the world, joining us for this very, very important discussion on the impact of migration on women, perspectives from Latin America. Excuse my voice. My name is Sajid Ashraf, and I am president of GlobalWE. Harvard Global Women's Empowerment is a shared interest group of the Harvard Alumni Association. We are dedicated to the empowerment of women through education, dialogue, and connection among individuals working for women's rights and freedoms worldwide. We highlight and raise awareness about issues concerning women's empowerment, including but not limited to education, political rights, freedom from violence, women's health, and economic empowerment. Our board is as global as our interests, with representatives in the US, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. In fact, I currently am in Dubai. Today, we have many GlobalWE board members with us, including Arthi, our programs chair, Leah, our president-elect and treasurer, Barbara, our GlobalWE Connect chair, and my apologies if I'm missing other people because with Zoom, I can't see everybody, but welcome and thank you for being here. While the COVID-19 situation has curtailed travel and certain other activities, it has allowed us to come together in unique ways. What we've loved is the fact that we can truly make our events global, and today is no different. This discussion today is one of these rays of sunshine, a way for us to come together and virtually connect as we discuss this key issue of migration and its impact on women and our empowerment. As someone who has migrated multiple times, I'm really looking forward to learning from our panelists. Before we begin, we would like to take a screenshot for social media. Everybody who's okay with being part of that, please turn your cameras on now. Okay, Arthi, over to you whenever you're ready to take the picture.
All right.
Where's Becca?
3, 2, 1, everyone smile. Okay, we have 2 more people join in, so we'll just redo this. 3, 2, 1, smiles. Thank
Great.
you.
Thanks, Arthi. Before we start officially, I would like to thank the board for all of their efforts and support. In particular, Arthi, our program chair, Barbara, our Connect chair, and Kendall, our marketing chair, for all their amazing work. Before I turn it over to Barbara, I would like to request, unless you're speaking, to please keep yourself on mute. I'd now like to introduce Barbara Barano Paschal, who is our GlobalWE Connect chair and will be our moderator today. Barbara?
Thank you, Sajida, and thank you all for being here for this very important and informative discussion. I look forward to this conversation, and I will be introducing our panelists and ask them to share a little bit more about their experiences and their knowledge of this important topic. I will remind everyone that this event is being recorded, and if you could please mute your microphones and turn off your videos if you aren't speaking, and we will be very happy to take questions after a set of moderated questions once we hear from some of the panelists. And so to start, I'd like to ask each panelist to introduce themselves. First, let me tell you who they are. The first panelist is Professor Raquel Aldana, and she is the Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of Law at UC Davis School of Law. We also have with us today Milena Montenegro, Gender and Social Inclusion Advisor with the American Bar Association's Rule of Law Initiative. We also have Rebecca Shute, Senior Technical Advisor with the American Bar Association Rule of Law. Thank you all to our panelists and to everyone who's here today. Now I'd like to have the panelists introduce themselves, just say a little bit about what you do professionally and your background, and then we will have Milena Montenegro give a presentation in Spanish with English interpretation regarding some of the work that she's doing in Colombia. So I'd like to start first and ask Professor Raquel Aldana to introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. First, let me thank the organizers of this amazing conference. It's really amazing to be with you from all over the world, and I see some of my friends from Costa Rica and from Mexico and from my Harvard days. And so it's such an honor to be in this space. So I am currently a law professor. I began my legal career as a human rights lawyer I want to begin just by saying that migration is a topic that is very dear to my heart, since my own personal story is linked to migration and forced displacements from the Central American region. I came to the United States in 1982. I was just a child, but it did not escape me that though we were very fortunate as a family to have migrated legally because of a church-sponsored visa, our fate would have been sealed by US policies at the time. So I dedicated my career as a lawyer to really try to understand what led to the civil wars in the region. And I worked for the Center for Justice and International Law, really focusing on post-conflict efforts to reimagine what democracy might be like in those areas. And so most of my work was focused on transitional justice issues and those kinds of efforts. But forced displacement, the phenomena of forced displacement cannot be disentangled from that. So I think that migrants are the face of failed democracies. They are they're less invisible in that they cross borders, and the crossing of borders makes them relevant in ways that they remain often invisible and irrelevant when they are within their borders. So they force us to take a deeper look at the issue. So I've been writing about forced migration for a long time. My focus is a lot on Latin American migration, whether to the US and other places. And I'll stop there, but it's such an honor to be with you today.
Thank you, Professora. I really appreciate that introduction, and thank you for making that personal connection and sharing that with us. Next, I'd like to have Ms. Rebecca Shute introduce herself.
Thank you so much, Barbara, and thank you to the organizers for the honor of being with you today. I'll start with a bit of a disclaimer. Next to the other panelists and many of you in this room, I am not a Latin America expert, and the title of this event might be a little bit of a misnomer in my case. I'm a senior technical advisor at the American Bar Association's Rule of Law Initiative, which is an international arm of the ABA that seeks to promote democracy, human rights, and the rule of law worldwide. I specifically work on global programs that promote women's empowerment, including in the Latin America region. But the perspective that I bring is more from my background as an international human rights lawyer and an international criminal rights specialist. My background includes 10 years in democracy development before going into law, not primarily in the Latin America region, but across the world, working with legislatures, civil society, executive branches, and subsequently the judiciary to promote democratic values and institutions. I subsequently worked with the Carter Center, with UN Working Group on Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances, and with the UN Democracy Fund and a number of different projects. My work in international human rights and criminal law that I think I'm going to bring to the table and my perspective to date comes primarily from working at the International Criminal Court and as a director of the International Law and Human Rights Program for the only global organization of individual parliamentarians committed to upholding the rule of law and human rights, including many in Latin America who've worked on the issues that we're going to discuss today. Today, with ABA Roli, I'm proud to be able to lead a program that is fairly unique. It is funded by the Office of Global Women's Issues at the Department of State that seeks to combat intersectional barriers to women's economic empowerment. And I think we'll get into the meat of the conversation a little bit today, but recognizing the intersectional challenges that migrant women in particular face within the realm of economic empowerment or even economic equality has become a major focus of our work, especially in Latin America. So with that, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to hearing and learning from all of you.
Thank you very much for that introduction and for sharing what broad expertise you have in different areas relating to democracy and human rights, and the work that you're doing now is very exciting. Can't wait to hear more about it. Now we'd like to hear from Milena Montenegro with the American Bar Association Rule of Law Initiative. Milena, thank you for joining us. I understand you'll be giving your presentation in Spanish. And so we have an interpreter, Sandra Milena Alarcón Ruiz, who will be providing interpretation today. So please join me welcoming Milena, and Sandra will be interpreting. And if you have any questions or about this, just put it in the chat. We're very excited to hear from Milena. Hola, Milena, gracias.
Hola, Bárbara, gracias. Y gracias a cada uno de los asistentes a este encuentro. Bueno, yo soy psicóloga, soy especialista en política social con estudios de género y políticas públicas para población migrante, con amplia experiencia en el liderazgo de proyectos sociales, especialmente en los componentes de género y de inclusión social, que han resultado en procesos de fortalecimiento a gobiernos locales y a organizaciones de la sociedad civil. Sandra, si quieres ir traduciendo.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm Sandra Montenegro. I'm a psychologist. I'm a specialist in gender policies, and I work with, especially with social inclusions with local governments.
En los últimos años he trabajado en el diseño de metodologías encaminadas a mitigar la violencia de género y de vulneraciones a derechos humanos a población migrante desde diferentes entidades de cooperación internacional de Colombia. Sandra.
In the last years, I have been working with human rights and with some other topics in local governments and other institutions.
Ok, he trabajado con población migrante con un enfoque de género donde hemos podido trabajar con mujeres, con niñas, con población LGBTI, contribuyendo al fortalecimiento de la protección y restitución de derechos de esta población en el territorio nacional.
Okay. I have also been working with migrant population, with women, children, in order to work for their rights in our country.
Soy autora del podcast de Píldoras de Salud Mental para la Cuarentena, que contribuyó a orientar a las mujeres migrantes que estaban siendo víctimas de violencia de género en medio del confinamiento en los últimos 2 años, donde también se les orientó a cómo acceder a rutas de atención y gestión de sus violencias.
Okay, I am also the author of podcasts that helps women that are victims of gender violence, especially during the pandemic. That's it.
Finalmente, actualmente soy asesora de género y de inclusión social en Abarroli, donde he tenido la oportunidad de fortalecer al gobierno local, al gobierno nacional y a las organizaciones de la sociedad civil con el fin de mitigar la violencia y las vulneraciones a derechos humanos de las que son víctimas la población migrante de Venezuela en Colombia.
Okay, I am a gender and social inclusion advisor. I work with the local government in order to mitigate all the violence that the migrant population has gone through.
Agradezco mucho el espacio del día de hoy y espero que este espacio se repita y pueda contribuir a la mitigación de vulneraciones de derechos humanos para la población migrante.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and I hope that these kinds of meetings help to mitigate all those violences that migrant population have to go through when they go to different countries. Thank you very much.
And now Milena has some remarks, a presentation that she's going to deliver about several issues relating to migrant women living in Colombia from Venezuela and the national government, the Colombian government's response. So now Milena will give some remarks and then we'll have other questions that we ask of the panelists. Gracias, Milena. Puedes continuar.
Gracias, Bárbara. Bueno, buen día nuevamente para todos y para todas. Y para responder a esta pregunta es necesario primero hacer un contexto sobre la situación de las mujeres venezolanas migrantes en Colombia, donde se estima que actualmente hay 1.800.000 personas migrantes venezolanos en Colombia. De ellos, el 49% son mujeres, dentro de los cuales el 56% se encuentran en situación irregular.
Okay, good morning again. In order to answer this question, it is necessary to create a context of the situation of the migrant Venezuelan women in Colombia. It is estimated that 1,800,000 Venezuelan migrants are in the country. 49% of them are women, and 56% of them are in an irregular situation.
Pero, ¿qué significa estar en una situación irregular en Colombia? Este es un punto muy importante como criterio de análisis, porque esto significa estar en un escenario de desprotección total. Significa estar por fuera de la posibilidad de acceder a derechos básicos fundamentales, como lo son la salud, programas de educación, trabajo formal, casas refugio, atención psicosocial, redes de apoyo, sistemas financieros, y sobre todo no poder tener acceso a la justicia. El estatus migratorio irregular deriva y expone a las mujeres migrantes a diferentes tipos de violencias, donde hemos identificado que en este momento las principales son la violencia de género, la trata de personas en las modalidades de trata y explotación sexual y explotación laboral, la desaparición forzada, la discriminación y la xenofobia.
Okay, what does it mean to be in an irregular situation? It means being in a situation of lack of protection, outside the possibility of accessing basic and fundamental rights, such as having access to documentation, health, education programs, formal work, shelters, psychosocial care, support networks, the financial system and justice, among others. Irregular migratory status derives and exposes migrant women to different types of violence, among which the main ones have been identified as gender-based violence, human trafficking, sexual and labor exploitation, forced disappearance, discrimination, and xenophobia.
El número de las violencias contra las mujeres migrantes que están en el país ha incrementado sustancialmente entre el 2010 y el 2020, pasando de presentar 47 casos de violencia en el 2010 a 3.040 casos en el 2020. De acuerdo con la información del Instituto de Medicina Legal, quien recibe todas las violencias contra las mujeres, ciencias forenses y cálculos del Observatorio Colombiano de las Mujeres, en los últimos 3 años se ha notado un incremento significativo en diferentes tipos de violencias de género. Es así como la violencia de pareja aumentó en un 462%, la violencia sexual en un 268%, la violencia intrapersonal en un 234% y la violencia intrafamiliar en un 212%.
Okay, the number of acts of violence against migrant women in the country has increased substantially between 2010 and 2020, going from 47 cases of violence in 2010 to 3,040 cases in 2020. According to the information from the National Institute of Legal Medicine and Forensic Sciences, in calculations from the Colombian Women's Observatory between 2017 and 2020, a significant increase in different types of gender-based violence has been noted. Home violence increased by 462%, sexual violence in 268%, intrapersonal violence in 234%, and intrafamily violence in 212%.
Estas cifras deben sacudirnos y llevarnos a poner el foco de atención en un trabajo mancomunado, donde deben estar juntos los gobiernos nacionales y locales, las organizaciones de la sociedad civil y la academia, donde realmente se creen rutas que realmente respondan y propendan por resolver y mitigar las problemáticas que enfrentan las mujeres venezolanas en Colombia. Así, la violencia contra las mujeres venezolanas han incrementado aproximadamente en un 1000% para 2020 en comparación con los registros del 2015. Cifras que en algunos escenarios se han justificado por el aumento de mujeres migrantes en Colombia y que en nuestra opinión no debe ser una excusa o un argumento válido para evadir responsabilidades o tareas pendientes a realizar por parte de los diferentes actores involucrados.
These are figures that should shake us and lead us to focus on joint work between civil, government, and academic entities, which really responds to solving and mitigating the problems faced by Venezuelan migrant women in Colombia. Thus, violence against Venezuelan women increased by approximately 1000% by 2020 compared to the 2015 records. Figures that in some scenarios have been justified by the increase in migrant women who have arrived in Colombia, and that in our opinion should not be the excuse to evade responsibilities or pending tasks to be carried out by the different actors involved.
En los últimos 5 años se ha advertido que las violencias son diferentes de acuerdo al territorio. Y es que no todas las migraciones y no todas las mujeres que llegan al país lo hacen de la misma manera. Es así como, por ejemplo, las cifras muestran que en el territorio, en la parte del norte de Santander, donde hay gran cercanía con la frontera, es más evidente el incremento en el tráfico y trata de mujeres y niñas migrantes. En cuanto a la violencia de género, este es el tercer problema de salud pública para las mujeres migrantes en Colombia.
In the last 5 years, it has been noted that violence is different according to the territory and the borders that give way to the arrival of the migrant population. An example of the above are the figures that show that in the department of Norte de Santander, where the proximity to the border is evident, there has been an increase in the trafficking of migrant women and girls. Regarding gender-based violence, this is the third public health problem for Venezuelan women in Colombia.
Como ustedes lo han visto a lo largo de esta narrativa y este contexto que he querido contarles, el panorama es desalentador. Y es justo aquí donde se identifican dos de las situaciones más importantes y estructurales a transformar. La primera es que se debe garantizar un acceso fácil a los procesos de regularización para la población migrante que garanticen el acceso a derechos fundamentales. Y lo segundo es que se deben hacer procesos estructurales en el cambio de marco normativo para de esta manera garantizar el acceso a la justicia a las mujeres migrantes, para que de esta manera puedan acceder de una manera más fácil a la protección jurídica por parte del gobierno colombiano.
Okay, the scenario is quite discouraging. And it is precisely here that some of the situations to be transformed are identified, taking into account 2 risk scenarios: women and the Venezuelan migrant population in an irregular situation without access to rights, and women and the Venezuelan migrant population without access to administrative and judicial procedures for their attention and protection, which leads to women and the Venezuelan migrant population being victims of violence and recruitment in illicit economies without any legal protection for them in Colombia.
Después de tener el contexto, ahora vamos a hacer las recomendaciones que debe tener en cuenta el gobierno colombiano, donde planteamos parte de la ruta de acción que en este momento está implementando Barano para responder a las necesidades identificadas por parte de las mujeres migrantes. Barano basa su estrategia para la atención a población migrante, especialmente en mujeres migrantes, teniendo en cuenta componentes encaminados a fortalecer tanto a los gobiernos locales, a los gobiernos nacionales y a las organizaciones de la sociedad civil.
Okay, as the second part of the question to be answered, we're going to see the recommendations we make to the Colombian government, where we propose as part of the action route a strategy developed by the American Bar Association to respond to the needs of Venezuelan migrant women. The American Bar Association based its strategy for serving the migrant population, especially migrant women, on the following components aimed at strengthening national and local governments.
El primer componente importante es hacer un ejercicio de fortalecimiento institucional, donde se revise todo el marco normativo, las herramientas, los protocolos y las rutas que en este momento tenemos para la gestión de violencias de género y se incorpore el enfoque migratorio para que de esta manera se dé una respuesta efectiva a las necesidades que se tienen en esta materia.
The first important component is the institutional strengthening, technical strengthening to improve the quality and access to services for migrant women who have been victims of sexual or labor exploitation, human trafficking, or gender violence. In this component, it is necessary to review and adjust existing or developing tools, protocols, and routes, seeking to include the migratory approach with review, adjustment, and implementation of different strategies.
El segundo componente es un fortalecimiento a la sociedad civil, donde se brinde apoyo a las organizaciones de base que actualmente están atendiendo directamente a mujeres para construir redes de apoyo, posibilitar procesos de integración comunitaria que sean seguros y que faciliten la ejecución de buenas prácticas, antidiscriminación y antisenofobia, y a través de ellas reducir la vulneración de derechos. El tercer componente es garantizar un buen proceso de servicios directos, donde hayan procesos de acompañamiento de orientación legal y de acompañamiento psicológico para que se haga el trámite del duelo migratorio y de las violencias de las que son víctimas.
Okay, the second component is the strengthening of the civil society, support of grassroots organizations that directly serve women to build support networks that enable community integration processes that are safe and that facilitate the execution of good anti-discrimination and anti-xenophobia practices, and through them reduce the violation of rights. And the third component is to have direct services, that is to say personalized scenarios for women to receive specific support for their needs, such as legal guidance and psychological support.
Y por último, se deben garantizar procesos de la documentación de las violaciones de derechos humanos en materia y sobre todo en materia de violencia de género, trata de personas y reclutamiento en economías ilícitas, para de esta manera poder incluir unos indicadores y unos criterios de análisis de violencia de género que permita saber qué está sucediendo y dar una respuesta adecuada a las mujeres y a la población sobreviviente de estas violencias.
And the last component is the investigation and documentation of human rights violations in terms of gender violence, human trafficking, and recruitment in illicit economies, which has made possible to include the migratory approach in the analysis indicators in order to measure the different forms of violence of which migrant women are survivors, the places where it occurs, and the responses they have had at the time of management of their violence.
Por último, de acuerdo a las últimas mediciones de Migración Colombia y Gerencia de Fronteras, más del 85% de la población migrante venezolana en Colombia tiene vocación de permanencia, lo que nos debe llevar a reflexionar sobre sus procesos de integración y la forma en que debemos generar una conciencia colectiva acerca de que la violencia contra las mujeres migrantes es una frontera por superar. Muchas gracias.
Okay. According to the last measurements of Migración Colombia and border management, more than 85% of the migrant population wants to stay in the country. So we need to think about their integration processes and the way in which we can generate like some collective consciousness about the violence against migrant women, which is something that we have to work on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Muchas gracias, Milena and Sandra, for interpretation. That was a very informative presentation about what's happening to Venezuelan migrants in Colombia and the action steps that need to be taken to address the many challenges that these women are facing, as well as women in other parts of Latin America. A lot of the themes that we're hearing are applicable in different parts of Latin America as well. And I'd like to now ask a few questions of the other panelists, and then if you all can prepare your questions in the chat or raise your hand, then we can have an audience Q&A as well. So to start, my first question is for Professor Aldana. In the United States, there's been considerable attention and media coverage being paid to the US-Mexico border and the Northern Triangle, which is Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, and less about what we just heard, what's happening in other parts of Latin America, Colombia, Venezuela, for example. What should we know about what's happening, what's taking place in this region as it relates to migration patterns more broadly? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I'll start out by just describing that there's three major patterns of migration from Latin America and the Caribbean. You've mentioned one, which is the one we hear most about, but there's also migration to Europe and actually Japan in significant numbers. But my remarks today will focus on the largest trend and perhaps the least discussed, which is intra-regional south-to-south migration. I saw a data point back in the 2010 that suggested that even back then it was already 63% of the overall migration from the Latin American region. So the reasons for migration in intra-regional migration are common to us because they're similar, right? It's looking for economic opportunities, escaping from violence, especially from private actors these days, as opposed to nations, but the relationship between private actors and nations is important to understand because many states have been captured by private actors like narco traffickers, for example. And there's also a less discussed phenomena of forced displacements that is resulting from mining or other mega projects, such as the building of hydroelectrics and oil fields. And this is especially true in Brazil, Ecuador, Peru, and Argentina. I also want to focus on the issue of women because women, just like we heard from Melina's presentation, make up a large portion of people who are migrating also with respect to inter-regional migration. And this coincides with global trends. The data puts this figure at around 50% of migrants today being women. And women in general are escaping privatized forms of violence, not exclusively, but certainly that's a large component. This includes domestic violence. They're desperate for economic opportunities to feed their households as the only breadwinners. That's another characterization. So a predominant feature of women who are migrating is that in contrast to men, they are the head of household, the sole source of income, and often are the sole providers of extended families. So not only are they facing the pressures of being the providers, but also stigmatization and discrimination for being single moms in their home countries. So I want to talk just briefly about the most significant corridors, and this is just a few highlights of some of the things that are happening in the region. We already heard about Colombia, and that's a really important phenomena because the displacement of Venezuelans is really so significant that it's become the second most important global phenomenon of forced migration. And in addition to Colombia, Venezuelans are fleeing other countries, Peru being the second largest. Let me focus on a little bit on a few other phenomena that sometimes we don't hear enough about. One of them, for example, just because I see one of my friends from Costa Rica here, is migration from Nicaragua to Costa Rica, which has been a persistent migration pattern and is already about 10% of the population of Costa Ricans being Nicaraguans. So I'll just mention it for now and then come back to it a little bit. We also see significant migration from in Chile, in the Dominican Republic, in Brazil, and Panama. For example, a lot of Haitians who have been going to the Dominican Republic with lots of problems with Dominican Republic's resistance to even recognizing the citizenship of Haitian-born children in the Dominican Republic. Chile has seen a significant increase in migration, and currently overall migration to Chile is already representing 4.4% of the population. And there's Haitians, we've heard about that because Haitians are now fleeing Chile because of the discrimination to the US and are being deported back to Haiti or kept in Mexico alongside Central Americans. But there's also been Colombian migration to Chile. And so Chile has experienced a lot of transformations because it's such a small country. Just one more phenomenon I want to focus on is the transmigration phenomena in Mexico, largely of Central Americans, but Mexico is now experiencing transmigration phenomena from Haiti, from Africa, and from several countries in the world, with the added layer of complexity, right, of the remaining Mexico programs and Title 42 expulsions from the United States, which is forcing Mexico for the first time to view itself not as a transmigration nation, but as a nation that should be thinking about becoming a host of asylum seekers. So you also see Mexico having had a very interesting experience of both having to become the border enforcement site for US policies, because the US has poured billions of dollars into Mexico to do the enforcement from that region. But today also Mexico having to reconsider, right, and offer asylum. And there has been an uptick of asylum applications in Mexico. One data point that I found interesting is that between 2018 and 2019, Mexico received over 90,000 applications, which is actually comparable to the numbers of applications that the US receives on a yearly basis. So you start to see a shift in Mexico becoming a recipient of asylum seekers rather than just a place of transmigration. I want to maybe focus my remarks, because I know time is limited, on the unique ways that migration is affecting women. And I'll focus just on a few observations related to this. So for women, and we heard this also from Melina's presentation, gender discrimination and gender violence is a recurring and systematic factor that exacerbates the push factors of migration from the receiving country, because they experience these things from, you know, the sending country, from the receiving country. So their vulnerability of violence and discrimination follows them through their journey. So one of the examples of this is that they don't have meaningful access to reproductive health in the face of rampant sexual exploitation. So many migrant women who flee a country, right, have had to bear children from abusive men. They also experience rape along the way and either become pregnant or acquire sexually transmitted diseases. And then when they get to the country where they are seeking protection, they are denied access to abortion and are even confronting forced sterilization at their destination. So they're experiencing the same degree of the absence of health and reproductive rights, irrespective of their location, whether they're at home, their poverty being the poverty and race being the biggest obstacles. But once they reach their destination, then it becomes their immigration status that denies them these basic rights. Migrant women also, regardless of education, are participating in low-wage jobs. And I want to focus specifically on the fact that they are occupying in predominant ways the caretaking functions. They're taking care of our children, they're taking care of our elderly. And the irony of this, right, is that they are having to leave behind their own children and their caretaking functions in their host countries in order to become that in their home countries, in order to become that in their destination countries. And on top of then the irony that they are becoming our predominant caretakers, they're being exploited and stigmatized for having abandoned their communities and children in ways that I think force us to think about structural solutions, because it's not enough to focus on what's happening to them once they get here, but to really take ownership and agency to see this as a transnational phenomena that requires solutions that are also transnational. I also want to focus on family separation as this huge issue that is impacting women and that is generating trauma for them. Women they're caught in impossible choices. So many of them choose to travel with children, and because they choose to travel with children, they're scrutinized and they're said to be bad moms because they're putting children in danger. But for many of them, it's between leaving them back home or traveling with children. And I think that, again, that gender discrimination and the lens of viewing them as irresponsible mothers is something that relates to women and not so much to men. We also have heard about the sexualization and and of female migrant labor and human trafficking. So I won't labor on that a lot, but that is a huge problem for women that is unique. So I will talk one more issue that I think is important to highlight is the significant legal gaps that exist in the protection of migrant women that I think also require transnational amelioration. One of them is the disprotection of gender as a distinct group for protection against persecution. So the asylum and refugee definition from early on left women out, mostly because women are a large group and we were worried about the floodgates. But by leaving women out, it has been really complicated to try to argue for their protections under, for example, the fact that they need to be protected as a special social group that forces women into categories that are difficult to justify. So we need to really think about that. Another area that needs rethinking is family law, because one of the things that we don't think a lot about is how migration complicates issues of child custody and also issues of alimony and payments of child support. Two patterns: when men leave, the legal obligations, they don't end, but they're unenforceable across borders. And when women leave, right, they also are said to abandon their rights to these benefits. So there's lots of gaps that we need to think about, and I'll end here just because I want to make sure Rebecca has an opportunity to weigh in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You raised a number of very significant issues and many different topics that we could speak about for many hours. And they're very good things for everyone to think about as we consider this issue in many different parts of the world and today's discussion in Latin America and through to the US. Thank you very much. I'd like to ask a two-part question to Rebecca. They're a little bit different questions, but they raise issues that are important to this discussion. The first question is simply, what additional considerations must we be taking into account? We've heard a number of issues raised regarding migration, the impact of women, some legal considerations. So what else should we be thinking about when it comes to compliance with human rights laws and norms, for example, or the form of government of the countries where women are migrating to and from, and what impact might that have on the situation? And then the other question I have is about the ABA and its rule of law initiative and other initiatives, the American Bar Association, for those who don't know. Can you share a little bit about what work the ABA and its entities are doing to assist refugees and migrants and work more broadly on these topics? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Barbara. That's a whole lot to wrap my my comments around, but I'll do my very best. So in terms of your first question, what further considerations we should have, I'd like to first include a human element, secondly include a legal element, and third include a policy element that I think we should consider when looking at this issue. So taking a step back for a moment and situating this conversation, of the 79 million forcibly displaced persons in 2019, 2020 COVID years, we don't have as great figures, and this year will be very different, or last year will be very different because of the Afghanistan situation. Approximately 700,000 were considered to be in a refugee situation in the Americas, but that's vastly underreported. One reason that's underreported is because it doesn't include internally displaced persons, and that's something that we haven't really talked about. We've been talking about migration only in terms of crossing borders and the needs that one has when one goes to a second or third or fourth receiving state. In actuality, a lot of the migration flows within Latin America and elsewhere are internal, and those are the ones that you don't hear about because it's somebody fleeing a situation to go live with a family member, then going deeper and going to live with another family member. So I just want to reinsert that element to the conversation. The other thing that I'd like to say in terms of the human element, and this was underscored, I think, by Professor Aldana writ large, and also very much by my colleague Milena in terms of the individuals that she works with in Colombia, is that migrant women have been subject to multiple and compounding indignities in many cases. The indignities or the harms that led them to leave their situations often extortion, abuse, rape, transactional sex along the way. And then unfortunately, at their point of destination, the protections and provisions that are supposed to be in place for their well-being and continued growth are not there. So I think that segues into my second area of comments about the legal obligations of states and what can be done. So in vast contrast to all of the diagnosis of the challenges that you've heard and that many on this call know far better than I, the actual legal framework in the Americas is quite robust to govern asylum, to govern women's rights. It covers territorial asylum, diplomatic asylum. We have the Inter-American Convention on the Prevention, Punishment, and Eradication of Violence Against Women. As opposed to its European counterpart, which is widely known as the Istanbul Convention, that has a specific provision for migrant women. So it says that the states parties shall take special account of the vulnerability of women to violence by reason, among others, their race, ethnic background, status as migrants, refugees, displaced persons. Beyond the convention, which is binding international law, there's also the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which has adjudicatory authority in many of the jurisdictions of which we're speaking. And the Inter-American Court has taken a far more expansive view of what rights are due migrants, and especially, once again, highlighting women migrants than have other courts of a similar nature. In one seminal opinion so this is advisory opinion 18 that came out of the Inter-American Court, which actually, if those geeks among us want to look it up, this came in response to a request from Mexico related to a Supreme Court decision here in the United States on what labor rights were due to migrants. The Inter-American Court expanded the definition of asylum seekers and migrants to include those fleeing generalized violence. So not just the specific categories that had been previously determined either by treaty law or by international courts or domestic jurisdictions. So you have quite a huge gap here between the de jure and de facto realities. So what can be done about it? In terms of Maslow's kind of hierarchy of needs, at the basic level, states need to be responsible, of course, for non-refoulement or second-degree refoulement, meaning returning an individual to a country that will then send them back to the country from which they're fleeing harm. Beyond that, I think there is now established jurisprudence that governs the Americas, enshrining proactive duties and affirmative responsibilities by states to migrants, including safety. We've talked about some of the health needs, especially of women. In COVID times, these have been exacerbated, of course. The protection, particularly in state-run communities. So, for example, refugee centers against violence, taking prophylactic measures to ensure that the living situation is such that does not encourage women or allow women to be abused within the protection of the state. Those are kind of the basics. And then you can go up from there in terms of the vocational services that can or should be provided and affirmative duties of the state with regards to ability to hold property, ability to travel freely, ability to build credit, employment opportunities, etc. And so that segues into your second question. I'm running out of a little bit of air here, trying to fit everything in into what the ABA is doing, the American Bar Association is doing. And I think I'll give you 3 quick examples, and I'll try to make this very quick because I know we're at the end of our time. The first is the program in which I work directly, which takes a mainstreamed approach to the needs of migrants within the context of gender. So we used to talk, we still talk, in the development world about mainstreaming gender considerations into every assistance project, every initiative that we undertake. Now we've got to go a step further. And when we think about specific gender programs, we need to mainstream the needs of migrants in them. So the program that I quickly mentioned at the outset, and I would love the opportunity to discuss with anybody if we don't have time on this call, the Legal Reform Fund looks at 5 pillars, 5 barriers to women's economic equality. And we're working currently in 4 pilot countries, 2 in Latin America, Mexico and Guatemala, and 2 in East Asia Pacific, also in countries that have their own migration patterns and migration issues, and mainstreaming the needs of migrant populations into property ownership, travel, credit, employment issues, and access to institutions. The second kind of intervention that I can very, very quickly mention, Professor Aldana spoke about one of the lesser known or lesser discussed migrant issues in Central and Latin America between Dominican Republic and Haiti. And I have not really heard, I mean, it's dwarfed, of course, when you look at the numbers of individuals coming from Venezuela to Colombia. I'm not sure most people know this, but I didn't know this until fairly recently, that outside of Turkey, that Colombia was the second biggest recipient of refugees or asylum seekers in 2019, once again, before the current Afghan crisis. In the Dominican Republic, there was a legislative reform intended to disenfranchise second-generation Haitian, Dominican-born Haitian of Haitian descent individuals. And there was a wide miscrediting of individuals' background as part of this, and broad discrimination and racial profiling. So the ABA took on a very tactical, strategic response with certain civil society organizations who knew the lay of the land on the ground to try to educate individuals on their rights, to try to correct some of the mischaracterizations of individuals on this registry, and ultimately to provide legal aid to individuals who were falsely denied their citizenship under Dominican law, which I think might be of interest to this audience. And contrary to many of the pillars of international laws we know it, was a retroactive law enforceable by an executive appointed body. Very, very quickly, the third example that I just want to give of the kind of work that we do is not actually related to Latin America, but I think a sign of where we could go. So this is kind of the past, present, future is what I'm trying to spell out in terms of our ABA initiatives. And that's when individuals are in a third country, their claims are different than that of asylum seekers or immigration claims. Not only are they legal claims, they have to navigate very complex policy processes in some cases, and very mutable, ever-changing, dynamic policy processes. So what we're currently working on, and this is quite nascent with the ABA in collaboration with the Commission on Immigration and a number of other entities, is an initiative to have pro bono attorneys support refugee claimants in third countries and help them navigate the UNHCR process, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights process, as well as those domestic processes that the Commission on Immigration has specialized in for so long and does so much good work in. I'm going to stop there. I went way over time, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was an incredible amount of information that you shared about those questions, and we will hopefully, actually we can provide more information to the people who signed up for this webinar about the initiatives that were discussed today. In order to keep things on time, what I'd like to do is have the 2 questions that have been posed in the chat be answered by the panelists, and then I'll turn it over to our program chair of the Gupta to provide closing remarks. And so I'm going to summarize the two questions. And so panelists, please feel free to answer one or both of them to the extent you feel comfortable. The first question has to do with the extent to which making this a World Health Organization priority with a focus on physical, nutritional safety, and psychological status for protection against stressors such as those caused by migration, to what extent would that help with this situation, that kind of support, that kind of elevation as an international World Health Organization priority? And then the second question is about refugee camps and the ways in which refugees convene or gather in countries in Latin America. To what extent is that different from other parts of the world where we have learned about these massive refugee camps and makeshift refugee camps? So to the extent to which the panelists could answer one or both of those questions, that would be great. And then we'll close out this session.
In the interest of time, I'll just chime in if that's okay. I find the promise of the idea, rather, of focusing on this issue as a or framing this issue as a public health issue to be very, very promising. I'll just say a few thoughts that I have. One is to think about whether the World Health Organization, for example, could take this on. I just listened to a podcast discussing how significantly under-resourced the World Health Organization is, which explains, right, why they have not been effective in responding to the pandemic. So rather than just be negative in my remarks, I would say it's a wonderful idea. I think we have to think in a more multifaceted way. The Global Compact on Refugees really introduced this concept of burden sharing that took, this approach to meaningfully engage multiple actors, multiple nations, but also the private sector and frankly, individuals in the project of this magnitude. So I do think nations have a role, and the US, for example, has said a lot about let's focus on the root causes and addressing the root causes of migration. I'm still waiting to hear a lot more about the Biden plan in those areas, but I think a focus that would be on reproductive rights and reproductive justice in the home countries could go a long way in addressing why women are fleeing, right? To think very meaningfully about shelters. There are no shelters in many of these nations today to deal with the problems of domestic violence. And so if we invested in that, instead of arming more military people to enforce migration laws, which is very costly, I think that alone, a reframing and a reshifting of priorities could go a long way.
Thank you. Would any other panelists like to answer one or both of those questions?
I'll piggyback a little bit on Raquel's comments. Firstly, one thing that we haven't mentioned is when women succeed, and that might be, a relative term, as migrants, there can be repercussions, that there can be unintended consequences. That's something that we've been looking at more and more frequently in the international development, that when we empower women, when they are connected with programs, for instance, that give them employment in a new country, and they come back to the same household dynamics, or they come back to the same cultural dynamics, that can have some negative ramifications and unintended consequences. In terms of the WHO question, I completely agree with Raquel, Professor Aldana, and that I would look for a systemic and holistic approach. That framing it as a health issue, I think, is very helpful from a policy standpoint, but also can relegate the answers and the responses to a health framework. So while it might be more palatable to frame that as a public health issue, and it certainly is, the concerns of women who are migrating, and those include reproductive health, but also include the increased incidence of gender-based violence that they're exposed to, and a number of other health issues. It cannot be that alone. And because we often see health issues becoming siloed within certain ministries, within certain areas of international organizations, leaving aside the other considerations, the human rights considerations, the legal accountability, I think would be only seeing part of the problem. And that's why this is such a puzzle. That's why these are intractable issues that we're still here discussing because of the interconnection. We do have mechanisms, and Raquel mentioned a couple of them, to unite some of these areas of consideration, whether they be legal, whether they be health, whether they be education, whether they be employment. And I don't think that we've seen them deployed to their fullest extent yet. So I think that would be my comment.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Milena, would you like to add anything or any final remarks before we conclude?
Sí, Bárbara. Solo complementar a lo dicho por mis colegas, y es que la migración en este momento no es un tema que solamente afecta a los países de manera a nivel nacional, es un tema que debe abordarse a nivel región, a nivel de Latinoamérica, y se deben plantear respuestas oportunas para que estas migraciones se den de manera ordenada y de manera segura. Y una de las apuestas que se debe hacer a nivel región es garantizar el fácil acceso a la regularización para que de esta manera se pueda prevenir la multiplicación de vulneraciones que actualmente se están presentando. Segundo punto es garantizar que se fortalezca el marco jurídico que en este momento se tiene a nivel de cada uno de los países referente a las migraciones. Y por último, se deben hacer unos procesos de integración comunitaria donde se involucre también a las comunidades receptoras y comunidades de acogida para que estos procesos sean seguros y no generen un conflicto entre población migrante y población de acogida.
Okay, so she said that migration is not only an issue at a national level, but it's also regional, and timely responses must be given so that these migrations take place in a safe and timely manner, guaranteeing all rights to migrants. This will be the first step for national and local governments to prevent the multiplication of violations that are currently occurring. In second place, to guarantee the strengthening of the national legal framework regarding migration. And number three, to guarantee orderly and safe community integration processes for the migrant population.
Gracias, Milena. Thank you, Sandra, for interpretation. And I want to thank all of the panelists for a wonderful discussion, very informative, so many issues being presented today that we look forward to continuing the conversation with GlobalWE and the American Bar Association Rule of Law Initiative. So I'd like to thank Professor Raquel Aldana, Milena Montenegro, and Rebecca Shute for joining us today, and Sandra Milena Alarcón Ruiz for interpretation. Thank you all very much. And now I'd like to turn it over to Program Chair Arti Gupta to give some announcements and closing remarks. Thank you all.
Great. Thank you, Barbara, and thank you everyone for this wonderful discussion. A special thanks to all the panelists, Professor Raquel Aldana, Rebecca, Milena, Sandra for interpreting. As a global citizen, today's webinar gave me, and I'm sure a lot of members attending, a deeper insight into the issue of migration in Latin America and its impact on women, and also just an insight into the work each one of you are doing in your own capacity to bring this issue to light and help address the issues. I would also like to thank other members of the ABA who helped us during the planning and execution of this event. I would like to extend a big thank you to our moderator, Barbara, for leading the discussion and moderating it so well, bringing it all together. A big thank you to all our members who've joined us today, and hope you join us for our next event, which is our annual roundtable. And the topic for that event is Invest in Her, Women Impacting Growth Through Entrepreneurship. The event is scheduled for Feb 19th, 10 a.m. We also have our Connect Fireside Chat coming up in March and our annual expo in April. You will be hearing more about all of these events in our newsletter and via email. Also, we're looking for global focused events. So if there is a topic or a speaker you're passionate about and would like to help suggest or plan an event around it, please connect with us by sending us an email to programs@harvardglobalwe.org. We would be happy to invite you to champion the event. Lastly, I would like to remind you all that we are a nonprofit volunteer-run organization, and your support will go towards funding the administrative costs that keep us connected, along with funding our essay contest winners, our annual expo, and helping us continue to expand our educational offerings. Your donation will help us raise awareness of global issues and support us as we work towards our vital mission of women's empowerment through education, dialogue, and connection among individuals working for women's rights and freedoms worldwide. Hope you all enjoyed today's program. Stay safe and have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for being here. Stay well.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a good day.